You know, when a suspect runs from the police or lies or tries to hide evidence, it just seems like a dead giveaway, right? They must be guilty. But what if they're running for a totally different reason? How does the law even begin to untangle a guilty conscience? Well, we're going to dive into exactly that through the incredible case of R. v. White.
So let's set the scene. It's August 1989, near Ottawa. A man's body is found in a remote area. He's been shot 6 times. It's brutal. Police immediately want to talk to his 2 friends, Richard White and Yves Cote, who were the last people to see him alive. But there's a huge problem. They've just vanished.
The victim's name was Wei Kueng Chiu, and this wasn't just some random act of violence. The police quickly realized it was an execution. Chiu was shot twice with a shotgun, and then 4 more times in the head with a .22 caliber pistol. The fact that 2 different guns were used, that suggests this was cold, planned, and personal.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. There was a critical link between these 3 guys. Chiu, White, and Cote weren't just friends. They had all done time together. And at the moment of the murder, all 3 of them were out on parole. So they're all in this very precarious situation, which just adds a whole other layer to this story.
Okay, so with Chiu dead, all eyes turn to White and Cote, and their actions right after the murder, man, they basically leave this trail of breadcrumbs that seems to scream, "We did it." They don't just lay low, they go on a full-blown cross-country crime spree.
Just look at how fast this all went down. August 26th, the 3 buddies are together. The very next day, Chiu's body is found, and just 2 days after that, White and Cote are already 500 kilometers away robbing a bank. A week later, they rob the same bank again. Their run from the law finally ends just a few days after that when they're cornered by police back in Ottawa.
And this is where you can really see the desperation setting in. I mean, they just ghosted their parole meetings, which is an automatic arrest warrant. White didn't even bother to pick up a $400 check waiting for him, money you know he needed. And the things they said, wow. Cote tells his landlord, the less you know, the better. And White straight up tells a friend they snuffed somebody back in Ottawa. These are not the actions of innocent men.
So the chase comes to this really dramatic end. As the cops are closing in, Richard White makes a last-ditch effort to ditch a .22 pistol, throwing it under a parked car. Police grab it, send it to forensics, and the result is just unbelievable. It's not just any gun. It is one of the murder weapons used to execute Wei Kueng Chiu.
Okay, murder weapon in hand, this should be case closed, right? Well, this is the exact moment the story stops being a simple crime drama and turns into a really fascinating legal puzzle. Because all of that behavior, the running, the hiding, the lies, what does it actually prove in a court of law?
I mean, if you're the prosecutor, this is a slam dunk. Their actions just scream consciousness of guilt for the murder. Why else would you flee the city, rob banks for getaway cash, and then try to ditch the murder weapon? It really does look like an open and shut case.
But not so fast. The defense came back with a really clever counterargument. They said, yes, our clients acted guilty, but it had absolutely nothing to do with the murder of their friend.
And here is the huge dilemma the jury had to deal with. Just put yourself in their shoes for a second. The prosecution says they ran because they committed murder, but the defense says, no, they ran because they were parole violators and had warrants out for their arrest. The prosecution says they hid the murder weapon. The defense says they were hiding the guns they just used in 2 armed robberies. It's the exact same set of facts, but it tells 2 completely different stories.
This whole idea actually has a legal name. It's called post-offence conduct. That's the official term for all those shady actions. Running, lying, hiding things. Prosecutors love this stuff because it lets them argue that the accused has a consciousness of guilt. But as this case shows, the million-dollar question is, a consciousness of guilt for what exactly?
You know, this question was so tricky, so fundamental, that the case of White and Cote went all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada. The highest court in the land had to step in and create some clear, consistent rules for how juries should handle this kind of messy evidence from now on.
So, the Supreme Court came up with this really clear 2-step guide for juries. It all comes down to what the accused person actually claims. So, step 1 is what you could call the ignore it rule. This is for when the accused admits to a smaller crime to explain why they ran. If their flight could equally point to either crime, the jury has to ignore it as evidence for the bigger one. But what if they deny everything? Well, that's step 2, the you decide rule. And in that situation, which is exactly what we have here, the jury has to consider the evidence of flight. It's then up to them, and only them, to figure out what it all means.
So, applying that rule here, because White and Cote denied having anything to do with the murder, all of it, the flight, the bank robberies, tossing the gun, all of that could be put in front of the jury for them to consider. The defense couldn't just get it thrown out.
Okay, that makes sense. But it brings up another huge question, right? For the jury to even use the flight as a piece of the puzzle, do they first have to be convinced, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the running was about the murder and not those other crimes?
And the Supreme Court's answer on that was a very firm no. This quote from Justice Major really gets to the core of it. That famous standard, beyond a reasonable doubt, it's only for the final verdict. You don't apply it to every single piece of evidence one by one.
Think of it like this. A jury's job isn't to build a wall where they test each individual brick to make sure it's perfect. Their job is to stand back and look at the whole wall, all the evidence together, and decide if that completed picture proves guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It's about the whole, not the individual parts.
So, let's zoom out. Why are we even talking about this one case from decades ago? Why does it matter so much? Well, because this ruling is about way more than just White and Cote. It gets to the very core of how our justice system deals with human behavior and how it protects the idea of a fair trial. It set a huge precedent for every courtroom in the country. All right, so let's boil this all down. What are the big things to remember from R.V. White? First, running away doesn't automatically mean you're guilty of a specific crime. Second, our system puts a ton of faith in juries to sort through all this messy, ambiguous human behavior. And maybe most important of all, evidence has to be looked at as a single big picture, not a bunch of separate dots. This is so important because it stops juries from making these huge, dangerous jumps in logic and helps protect people from being wrongfully convicted just because they panicked.
So after all that legal wrangling, what was the final outcome? The number is 2. In the end, the jury weighed everything, including the flight, the robberies, the whole shebang, and they found both Richard White and Yves Cote guilty of first-degree murder. And the Supreme Court of Canada, using the very rules we just talked about, said that verdict was sound and the convictions stood.
And that really leaves us with one last thing to think about. The law sets out these very careful rules to prevent a jury from jumping to conclusions. But human nature is a powerful thing. So honestly, if you were sitting on that jury, staring at 2 men who ran, robbed, and hid a murder weapon, could you really set that aside and weigh all the evidence perfectly fairly? It's a question that shows you just how incredibly tough the job of a juror really is.